Xin chào quý vị và các bạn. Cảm ơn các bạn đã dành buổi sáng thứ Bảy cuối tuần để cùng trao đổi học thuật với giáo sư James Selman. Đây là lần thứ 3 Book Hunter áp dụng format trao đổi trực tuyến cùng tác giả với sự trợ giúp của công nghệ dịch trực tiếp AI. Mặc dù AI còn xa mới có thể thay thế được con người, đặc biệt là những vấn đề ngôn ngữ phức tạp như triết học, chính trị, lịch sử, văn hóa, nhưng cũng đáng để chúng ta thử nghiệm. Và Book Hunter hy vọng rằng mỗi tháng sẽ tổ chức một sự kiện giao lưu với các tác giả trên toàn thế giới bằng hình thức này. Xin cảm ơn giáo sư Selman đã sẵn sàng chia sẻ với độc giả Book Hunter. Xin mời giáo sư chia sẻ đôi dòng về bản thân và lý do ông đến với công việc, cái chủ đề mà ông đang thực hiện.
Thank you for having me.
Can you?
Okay, I see. I'm not reading fast enough.
Yeah, no problem.
So, what were you asking me to introduce myself? Okay, so I'm a professor of philosophy and dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Guam. And although it's an American university, Guam is an island, maybe just a little bit south of Hanoi. On the latitude scale around the world, but we're only about 4 hours flight to the Philippines and another 2.5 hour flight to Hanoi from the Philippines, so we're not that far away. But Guam is a U.S. territory, so we're under the U.S. Department of Education. The United States is one of the few countries where an academic administrator, a dean, is not expected to do research. But I didn't spend so much time trying to learn Chinese and study Chinese philosophy to then give it up just because I was trying to herd cats. You know this joke, herding cats? You know, cats are very independent and you cannot really herd them. And that's the problem of trying to be an academic administrator, because professors are free thinkers and don't like to be told what they need to do to follow the rules of the university, you know, especially if they want to date their students. You know, this issue is a cross-cultural issue of professors wanting to date their students. But I am still actively publishing. And so one of the books I'll mention, Marcin Jacobi, a professor from Poland, and I have co-edited a Tao companion on the Lucia Chun Show. There's a web page on the Springer Nature publisher for the Tao companion series. That book is coming out next month in April. And so we're working on the Lucia Chun Show. I have a chapter in there on the just war theory. I recently published a paper, Asia Pacific Hope for a, that builds on a historical sociology idea that there may be hope for climate change coming out of Asian influences in Europe and America through the study of yoga and the introduction of Hinduism and Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism that may influence sustainable agriculture. So now I've started an adventure into agricultural ethics and have an interesting paper coming out, hopefully online, on why the state is obligated to feed its citizens. And if the state is too poor to feed its people, then other countries should chip in and help feed starving human beings. You know, about 1/3 of the world's population is living in a state of starvation.
Yeah.
And there are those foolish people, the muskrat, you know, Elon Musk, the muskrat, ran that Dodge thing and canceled the U.S. aid, the Universal United Agency for giving aid to other countries. More children starve to death. So it's a terrible situation that we've created.
Yeah.
Yeah. But let's go to the Lucia Chincho in the first question.
Okay, James. Let me remind the audience, our audience first. Cái dịch tự động AI này nó chưa bắt được cái tên tiếng Anh của cuốn sách. Các bạn để ý là khi nào mà gặp phải cái từ trông lạ lạ như là Luther Chinchu ấy, thì nó chính là tên cuốn sách là Lã Thị Xuân Thu. Được chưa? Lã Thị Xuân Thu. Và bây giờ thì tôi xin phép được giới thiệu một chút về tác phẩm của Selman, tác phẩm Thời và Trị trong Lã Thị Xuân Thu. Tên tiếng Anh là Timing and Rulership in Masterloo, Spring and Autumn Annals, là một nghiên cứu học thuật chuyên sâu về cách tác phẩm cổ điển Trung Hoa Lã Thị Xuân Thu hiểu và triển khai hai khái niệm cốt lõi là thời, tức là timing, và trị, tức là rulership hay là governance. Và đây là một tác phẩm được biên soạn vào cuối thời Chiến Quốc dưới sự bảo trợ của Lã Bất Vi, một bộ bách khoa triết học, chính trị, tổng hợp tư tưởng của nhiều học phái, Nho giáo, Đạo giáo, Nho gia, Pháp gia, Đạo gia, Âm Dương gia và rất nhiều các trường phái khác. Và thực sự là một cuốn sách rất thú vị mà James Salmon đã viết một cuốn sách để phân tích về cái chữ thời và chữ trị. Và bây giờ thì chúng ta hãy cùng vào nội dung chính của buổi hôm nay. Tôi xin phép được lần lượt hỏi James 6 câu hỏi. Câu đầu tiên, trong số các tác phẩm triết học chính trị của Trung Hoa, tại Việt Nam thì nhiều người nghiên cứu đánh giá thấp tác phẩm này và coi nó là tạp thư. Nhưng Book Hunter thì không cho rằng như vậy. Chúng tôi cho rằng đây là một tác phẩm độc nhất vô nhị về chính trị. Chúng tôi nhận thấy rằng các học giả phương Tây cũng rất quan tâm đến tác phẩm này. Vậy thì tại sao ông và các học giả khác lại quan tâm đến Lã Thị Xuân Thu như vậy?
Yeah, I see. Maybe we have to speak slower. I called it a miserable book in English, but it's a miscellaneous book that you sent me. Your translation was much better than this speaking translation. Yes, yeah, okay. Now when I speak slower, miserable and miscellaneous gets translated correctly. Okay, very good. Okay, speak slowly because you know you professors, we get excited. We like to talk too damn fast. Okay. So because, you know, the Hansher Ewenger, the bibliography of literature in the history of the Han book, lists the Lucia Chincho as a tsaja, meaning eclectic or miscellaneous work, then many people use that library bibliography classification as the shorthand to try to understand this large book. By ancient Chinese standards, it's a very big book. It's really 3 books, and they're actually very big books. It's over 200,000 characters. You know, you read the Lunya, the Analects of Confucius, and the sayings are very short sentences. It's like Confucius invented, you know, the 140 characters you get on X or Twitter or social media. You only get a small space. But the Lucia Chincho is a huge book. And then when a few scholars tried to read the book, because it is so big and it will take so much time, they find a few selected chapters that they would like to look at. Maybe they translate a few selected chapters. The great translator, now I blocked his name. Burton Watson, you know, translated a couple chapters of the Lucia Chincho. Everybody looks at it as a miscellaneous book, but in that list of miscellaneous literature in the bibliography, there are 3 philosophical texts: the Scherza, the Lucia Chincho, the Spring and Autumn Annals of Mr. Lu, and the Weinansa, the philosopher of Weinan, or philosophers of Weinan, the uncle to the Han Emperor Wu Di. the martial emperor, who ended up finding Huainan, the Prince of Huainan, guilty of rebellion, and the prince committed suicide. This is 100 years after Lu Shizhenqiu. But these three books, the Shurza, the Lu Shizhenqiu, and the Huainanzi, each have a unique philosophical perspective. And Master Shi Zhao was an attendant who helped Yang Wei 100 years before the Lu Shizhenqiu, and he sponsored a book that is no longer in existence, but there are fragments of the book. Chapters were found in a Japanese library and reconstructed. We reconstruct the book. There's an English translation by Professor Fisher. The Shurza is arguing for a moral approach to government, which, if you know, Xiangyang, his sponsor, who became the minister of the state of Qin, this 100 years before Lu Buwei and the Lu Shizhenqiu, okay? Xiangyang was a legalist. He proposed that everybody should be governed by the law. No one was above the law, including the royal family. And so when the prince made some mistakes, he wanted the prince to be flogged and beaten. And of course, you can't beat a prince in ancient China, just as it's difficult to beat a prince today. So they wanted to beat the teacher, of course. So not teaching the prince properly, so he made this mistake, right? But the book of Shurza proposes that you should love the people, not, have severe punishment under the law. And so Xiangyang didn't listen to Shurza, but Shurza's approach was to unify the empire. The Zhou dynasty was breaking down. And so 100 years later, by the time we come to the life of Lu Buwei actually helped break down the Zhou dynasty. Lu Buwei himself was appointed as prime minister of the state of Qin, and he led 3 wars against the Zhou kingdom. He was the leading strategist against the Zhou kingdom and totally vanquished the Zhou dynasty. But Lu Buwei's book, the Lu Shizhenqiu, also argues for a unified approach to the empire. And the Huainanzi in the Han dynasty argues for a unified empire, but with a decentralized power structure. Because he's a prince in the outlying area, he wants to keep his lineage and his unique power in his kingdom functioning without too much interference from Wu Di, and it didn't work out for him. But anyways, back to these. So these 3 books have their own unique perspective. Excuse me. Although they're listed as Saja, miscellaneous, they have a unique philosophy behind them. So those of us who have made a close reading of the Lu Shizhenqiu see that the text does have a unique contribution to pre-Qin political philosophy. The text is not an encyclopedia. Some people label it as an encyclopedia, nor is it a mere miscellaneous collection of essays. Particularly the first volume, the 12 months, the 12 chronicles that follow the 12 months, is the most organized section of the book. And it's kind of laid out as a weekly teaching plan, because Lu Buwei, as the prime minister, was the tutor of the princes. He was the tutor of the prince under King Shang, and then he was the tutor of the prince who would become the first emperor of China. And so those 12 chronicles, have a very tight structure to them. They open with a chapter on imperial ritual that becomes a chapter in the Book of Rites, one of the 5 Confucian classics. And then there are 4 chapters after that kind of cover the weeks of the lunar month. And so it's a lesson plan, as it were, for the weekly tutoring of the prince. And the book has a specific focus to unify the empire. And since the state of Qin in 256 BC, the state of Qin had killed the Zhou emperor, and then in 249, Lu Buwei led the Qin army again to attack the small state of Zhou, and again vanquished the Zhou emperor and kingdom. So the text, the Luxia Chenshou says now that the emperor is vanquished, who's going to unify the empire? Who's going to bring peace and security to the empire? Because the strong states are oppressing the weak states, and it looks like an oppressive situation. So the kingdom needs to be unified. And the text is pretty clear on that point. And why people who classify it as miscellaneous don't see the text does have a political agenda to unify the empire. But what's unique about it is it's not focused just on a Confucian approach or just a Taoist approach or just a Moist approach. It blends all of the pre-Qin philosophies together and kind of unifies them in the argument for the unification of the empire. And it, like the Shurtsa, proposes that the empire should not be governed by too harsh punishments. The punishments may be necessary, but you should not overtax the people, overburden the people, which the unifier of China did not pay attention to in building the Great Wall and building the canals and the highways. He overtaxed the people, and it quickly led to the downfall of the Qin dynasty that only existed from 221 to 206 BC. So why do people study this book? I personally was interested in studying the Luxia Chenshou because it offered an opportunity to provide a groundbreaking study of the role of proper timing in its theory of government, its theory of political order, which no one had previously noted for Luxia Chenshou. If you start to study the book, you see that some of the Chinese scholars have noted like 17 major focus of the book, like the just war idea is one of them. But none of them had pointed out that the book has a strong focus on proper timing, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes. And also I was interested to write a book about this book because it would launch my career. But then it took another 15 to 22 years, for other professors and scholars to start to study the value of the Luxia Chenshou. So as I mentioned before, in April, Springer Nature will release the Tao Companion to the Philosophy of the Luxia Chenshou. It's an anthology with some 20, 25 chapters by professors from around the world, sinologists and philosophers from Europe, from China, from Japan, from Taiwan, from America, from all over the place. So it's an interesting contemporary study of the Luxia Chenshou.
Thank you James. Mình xin nhắc một số các cái từ mà xuất hiện ấy khi mà AI nó dịch không đúng. Ví dụ như là Lã Bất Vi này, ví dụ như là Hoài Nam Tử này, ví dụ như là Lã Thị Xuân Thu, ví dụ như là nhà Chu, nhà Tần. Thì đó là một vài cái, và Thương Lưỡng, một số cái tên mà họ dịch chưa tốt. Tế tướng của nhà Tần, Thương Lưỡng, người là thiết lập là cái pháp trị. Vâng, xin đến câu hỏi thứ hai dành cho James. Theo ông, Lã Thị Xuân Thu có ảnh hưởng như thế nào đến văn hóa cai trị của Trung Quốc hiện nay?
Yeah, so, one thing we're doing here is we're teaching AI. Right? Is making a mistake with the translation, then we talk about it. and we're teaching AI how to be a better translator. It needs help because this is a technical language, right? This is a technical philosophical terminology.
It's very difficult, because it's the Chinese names and terms, and the English, the AI doesn't have the data for the English language.
Yeah, because you're using a Vietnamese AI, huh?
No, it's the American AI.
I think it's American AI, but it's focused on Vietnamese. Okay. In my opinion, how has Lu Shichinshou influenced the current governing culture of China? Okay. What I propose in my chapter, in that Tao Companion, in my Just War chapter, is that Lu Buwei started a threefold form of government: an aristocratic, aristotemo oligarchy. It's an aristocracy, ruled by the traditional status power people. And the temology is ruled by the wealthy. We'll get into this in a second. But the question, does it influence, on the one hand, you could just quickly say that because Lu Shichinshou is more than 2,000 years old, that it's unlikely it would influence modern Chinese communist governing culture, right? Where the Chinese governing culture today, it's a kind of local democracy. I don't know if many people know this. The villages vote on the party leaders. They are in the party. Everybody has to be a party member to be a government official. But the people vote on which party leader they want to have locally. But then the country is ruled by a president who's a dictator, and I'll get into this in a second, was also allowed to rule for life. He doesn't have to be reelected now. Sounds a lot like an emperor. On the one hand, it's too far old. Why should it control China? Well, on the other hand, because Lu Shichinshou built on the Zhou dynasty tradition of the Tianming. Tianming is the mandate of heaven, and the need for an emperor, or Tianzi, a son of heaven. Is a technical term, ancient term. The son of heaven is the emperor, to unify and rule the empire and the dynastic system. And although it changed, it still also had survived for over 2,200 years. So we can say that the Lu Shichinshou at least had an indirect impact on the dynastic cycle. And in fact, the Lu Shichinshou contains one of the earliest extant passages from Zuoyan, the philosopher who established the yin-yang wuxing, the yin-yang 5 phases philosophy. And there's a passage in the Lu Shichinshou that explains the dynastic cycle in terms of the conquest cycle of the 5 phases. Right? There's one way where the 5 phases, what's incorrectly called the 5 elements, can progress each other. Like metal comes out of earth, or fire comes out of wood. But there's also a destructive cycle, right, where water extinguishes fire. And so because the Zhou dynasty symbol was red and fire, then the Qin dynasty, the first emperor, declared that the Qin dynasty symbol was water and black, because they extinguished the Zhou fire. And then this led to a big debate in the Han dynasty. Was the Han dynasty earth, because earth is able to dam up and block water? And so should the color of the Han dynasty be yellow like the earth, and the symbol be earth because it's vanquishing the Qin dynasty? Or was the Qin dynasty was so short, should the Han dynasty be black and water because it really took over from the Zhou dynasty that had fire, right? But whatever it was, the Luxia Chunqiu tells this story, and the first emperor was concerned about it, and he said he was black in water to vanquish the red fire of Zhou. And then the Han had a big debate at court over what was the succession. Were they water vanquishing fire or earth vanquishing water? So in that sense, the Luxia Chunqiu had a big impact on the Han dynasty. It had a big impact on the way that the Huainanzi, that other third eclectic syncretic book, is written. And it influenced history. And so then it influenced the 2,200-year history of China. So that said, because the Luxia Chunqiu helps form the dynastic system, and it led to forms of a personality cult, right, focusing so much on the kind of divine power of the emperor, and the idea that there must be a supreme leader, right, like the Son of Heaven, like the emperor, then it's not too surprising that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, made President Xi ruler for life, as if he were a traditional emperor or son of heaven. And even Mao Zedong, right, as much as he attacked the aristocracy and attacked the trappings of the traditional society, he prided himself on his poetry, and all of the great emperors, were very artistic, right? Like Shikang in the Qing dynasty, maybe some of his art. If they weren't painters, they were poets. And so even Mao Zedong acted like the Chinese emperor. It's so ingrained in the culture, right? Over 3,000 years of this idea of following an emperor. So we could say it has some impact.
Thank you, James. Có một số từ xuất hiện thì các bạn có thể lưu ý, ví dụ như là đạo. Đạo là đây nhắc đến cái khái niệm đạo trong đạo gia, đạo giáo. Còn cái khái niệm mệnh, có một khái niệm mà James nhắc đến là thiên mệnh, thì nó là cái mà liên quan đến cái thuyết chính danh để khiến cho một người được trở thành hoàng đế, tức là thiên tử. Khi mà nắm thiên mệnh thì là trở thành thiên tử. Thì đấy là một vài cái từ mà AI chưa biết dịch. Xin đến với câu hỏi thứ 3 dành cho James. Chữ thời mà Lã Thị Xuân Thu đề cập đến có ý nghĩa thế nào với đời sống ngày nay?
Okay, yes. The term of timing and time, and really proper timing in the Luxia Chunqiu for modern life. One thing I should try to point out, if AI can translate it, is, Luxia Chunqiu contains those chapters in the 12 Chronicles that are in the Book of Rites that describe how to perform the imperial ritual to offer sacrifices and to placate the gods of nature, to be in harmony with the seasons. And at the end of each chapter, it says that if you misuse the ritual, if you perform the ritual out of season, if you perform the summer ritual in winter, or perform the winter ritual in the summertime, then there will be a climate disaster. 2,000 years ago, there's a recognition that human ritual technology, today when you hear the word technology, you think of this damn thing, right? And your computer. But technology is not only electronic, right? Your pencil, your paper is a technology. To perform a ritual in the school, right? We have graduation rituals, right? We have family rituals, you have personal rituals of like brushing your teeth is a kind of personal ritual, right? Well, if the ritual is performed, it's a kind of technology. And if it's performed out of season, the climate would be in disaster. And so here, this 2,000-year-old book tells us how we behave according to the seasons can influence the climate. And lo and behold, what has happened with the climate crisis is the way we have misused our technology is leading to climate crisis, rapid weather change. So that's one thing to point out. The other thing to point out is that the Lusha Chuncho breaks down the idea of time and proper timing on different levels. So there's the seasonality, or to govern according to the proper time, when the proper time entails acting according to the cosmic seasons. So in the ancient agrarian farming community, of course, you need to plant in the spring, weed in the summer, so the plants can grow and not the weeds, and then harvest in the winter and store any leftover food in harvest in the autumn, harvest in the autumn, and then store any leftover food in the winter, store your seed to plant in the summer and the spring, right? Plant again in the spring. And so you have to do your agriculture according to the seasons. And then if you're going to have a military operation, the tradition was to do military movement after the harvest in the autumn. So just as you cut down the plants, the emperor may have to cut down bad dukes and bad kings. They have to be cut down in the autumn. That's the appropriate time. You don't want to march the troops over the fields before you take in the harvest, right? You'll ruin your food supply and ruin your economy. Yeah. So that's what I mean by rulership according to the cosmic seasons. We don't think this way because most of us aren't on the farm anymore.
Very interesting.
Yeah, although you're probably closer, you may be close. You probably still have a relative on the farm.
Yes.
And my last paper is to bring back farming, because we have to change the way that modern agriculture has developed. Modern agriculture is part of the crisis, the climate crisis. It uses too much fuel. And you see this now with the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz. Not only is there less gas for our cars and buses, but there's all the residue that comes out of making gas creates fertilizer, right? Fertilizer comes from oil now.
Yes.
And now that's having an impact on modern agriculture.
Yeah,
well, maybe we need to go back to the old organic, fertilizer. What an idea, huh?
Crazy this year, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just to remind the participants, các bạn có thể chuẩn bị các câu hỏi để gửi cho giáo sư Selman ở trong phần tin nhắn, hoặc là một lát nữa sau khi mình kết thúc 6 câu hỏi thì chúng ta có thể đặt câu hỏi trực tiếp cho giáo sư. Xin tiếp tục với câu hỏi số 4. The fourth question. Quan điểm về trị trong Lã Thị Xuân Thu có điểm giống và khác như thế nào với triết học chính trị ở phương Tây? Một câu hỏi hy vọng rằng sẽ rất là thú vị để so sánh giữa Đông và Tây ạ.
Oh, well, I had a lot more to say about the third question, because it's not only cosmic timing, but Lusha Chuncho has different levels of timing. There's a historical changes. There's the immediate environmental changes. There's a cute story about the one city was attacking another city, and they sent out a scout to find the lowest point in the river where they could cross the river. And they marked the place. But over the night, there was a big rainstorm, and the river flooded. And when the troops tried to ford the river at that area, they got wiped out and drowned. So even immediate environmental changes, you have to be in harmony with the immediate environment. And then there's also the stories about the serendipity, the kind of accidental meeting, the time when two strangers meet. And they become great friends and then do great things together to help other people. How does it apply to modern life? You know, the financial investor always tells you it's about timing. You know, if only we knew we should have bought oil 3 weeks ago when it was at 60 US dollars a barrel, and now it's over $100. That's 40% profit right there if you were on time, right? And I bet you there were some people in the U.S. military, in the U.S. government rather, that bought oil when it was $60. So that said, we can see that modern industrial and post-industrial peoples and their countries are becoming less dependent on the changes of the seasons, and technology allows us to build ice skating rinks in the tropics or greenhouses in the Arctics. But this kind of disconnection is part of the environmental crisis, as I was already saying. So it's interesting that the Lucia Chincho is in tune with harmony with nature. So question 4, how does it differ in the concepts of governance from Western political philosophy? Oh boy, this could be, you know, a semester-long study for a few months.
Yes.
But, you know, generally speaking, so Western political philosophy explores the state and justice and human political rights. All right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Western political philosophy has a few different strains, right? There's the religious idea of the divine right of kings. Or you can talk about Plato and Aristotle, the Greek approach to citizenship and virtue. Excuse me. Or Machiavelli's power politics, Machiavelli's power realism. But for a large part, Western philosophy is about the social contract, which became the Constitution. And now every modern country has a constitution, which of course the Lucia Chincho had no idea about a constitution or a social contract. Although it's very interesting, they have excavated the Qin laws, which strongly influenced the Han Dynasty laws. And so there, you know, was a strong legal system in place, which is part of the basics for constitutionalism, right? So the Lucia Chincho is concerned about the state and not justice per se, but there are a lot of passages that talk about this Confucian and Moist concept of of rightness, usually translated as righteousness. Righteousness is hardly ever used in English anymore. And rightness sounds a little bit more to the point of doing things correctly at the right time in the right way. So the idea of the mandate of heaven and the Son of Heaven bears some similarity to the idea of the divine right of kings in the West, right? But unlike Hammurabi's Code or the Ten Commandments, Chinese written law did not come from the gods above, right? Even Hammurabi's Code says that he got the law from the gods in heaven. Chinese written law was always considered to be what we call positive law or human law. It was understood that at least the human emperor started the law. Actually, I have a paper proposing that it came out of the military, that the early military in the Shang dynasty had clear description of how to treat soldiers who broke the rules, and that had to be passed into civilian life at a certain point. But anyways, the written law was always considered to be a human construction open to modification. And this is still the case in modern China. How many constitutions they had? Over 9 constitutions in the 20th century. Every time there was a change of leadership, they rewrote the Constitution. But the role of virtue is very important in the Lucia Chincho. The ruler is supposed to have the virtue of impartiality. He's supposed to not have favorites. And the citizens are also supposed to follow basic, what would be called Confucian or Moist virtues of loving each other and treating each other rightly and being honest and acting with wisdom. And particularly, all the people should be willing to serve the state, and they should be willing to die for the state to protect the emperor. And there are even a few passages in the Lu Shi Chunqiu, a few stories where even the emperor had to die for the good of the people, which is a little bit problematic and often not paid attention to because of the personality cult of the emperor, right? Who's going to say there may be a time when the emperor may have to go? Sounds like a rebellion, right? But the Lu Shi Chunqiu does not advocate for a social contract or a constitution, but it does describe the cultural development from something like a disordered state of nature, where the strong oppress the weak. So a chief had to be established. And then from the chief, a minister had to be established, and then a king. And then the kings couldn't control international issues, so there had to be a son of heaven or emperor that could control international issues. So the role of power and power realism can be extracted from the Lu Shi Chunqiu, especially when the text proposes that the Zhou emperor has been vanquished and the states are in disarray and chaos, requiring a new emperor who can unify the empire. So you see, because the Qin people had attacked the Zhou people in 256 and then again in 249, by the time the Lu Shi Chunqiu is released in 239, there's been, a long history of Qin attacking the Zhou and other states that we'll get to in a moment, I guess. It was only natural that Qin was setting itself up to unify the empire, which the first emperor did in 221 BC.
Ok, James. Có một số chỗ mà dịch nhầm thành nhà Thanh thì các bạn lưu ý đấy là nhà Tần nhé. Tại vì từ Chin thì nó cũng hơi giống nhà Tần nhưng mà cũng na ná như giống nhà Thanh, nên là AI nó nhận diện nhầm. Câu hỏi số 5. Câu hỏi số 5, James. Theo ông, tính cách thương gia của Lã Bất Vi có ảnh hưởng đến cách quản trị nhà nước của ông ta và việc ông ấy tổ chức biên soạn Lã Thị Xuân Thu hay không?
Okay, this is an interesting question because in compiling this, the Tao Companion to the Philosophy of the Lu Shi Chunqiu, the historian Yuri Pines questioned whether Lu Buwei was in fact a merchant at all. That maybe calling him a merchant was part of the later attempts to discredit and slander him. So if you look at the story of Lu Buwei in the Shiji, the record of the Han historian Sima Qian, it looks like the record was tampered with. Because on the one hand, the record closes with Sima Qian, or his father, who started the history book, Sima Tan, praise Lu Buwei as Master Lu and say that he was a great man. But in the story itself, there are a lot of places where it implies that Lu Buwei was the father of King Zheng, who becomes Qinshi Huangdi, and that he was tied up with and encouraged the Lao Ai rebellion, and there was all kinds of sexual intrigue going on at court with Empress Dowager from the king who had just passed away, the father of King Zheng, who would become the first emperor. And so there's a lot of slander there. And so Yuri raised the question, maybe he's not a merchant either, because that's a kind of slander, right, for the scholar elite, especially of the Han Dynasty. A businessman, a merchant, a trader would not become a great writer, right, and edit a great book of any significance. And so there's a lot of attempts to discredit him. So maybe calling him a merchant was part of the discrediting. But my problem with that is that clearly Lu had a lot of money. He bought influence at the Qin court, and he bought influence with the Qin army to escape the state of Zhao. So if he wasn't a merchant, then where did all of his wealth come from? And that wealth played an important role in getting Lord Anghua and his wife to adopt Yiren as Prince Chu of Qin as their heir apparent. And he needed a lot of gold to get Lu and Yiren out of the state of Zhao when the state of Qin was on the verge of capturing the capital of the state of Zhao. He bribed his way out of there. And so where did all that money come from? Okay, so whether or not Lu was a wealthy merchant or not, maybe he was just wealthy, he certainly was competitive and excelled at being recognized. Now, it wasn't just his business idea, but the four other kingdoms, the state of Wei, the state of Chu, the state of Zhao, and the state of Qi, were also famous for gathering prestige and success by sponsoring large numbers of scholars to advise their rulers and to start compiling writings. And the Guanzi, the text called Master Guan, seems to be the result from the state of Qi and the Jisha Academy that had a lot of scholars working there. And so there was, Lu Buwei also had a lot of wealth, and so he would have already needed retainers himself to protect his wealth and protect his property and protect his own life, because this was the Warring States period, and there were not only a lot of military attacks, but there were also a lot of bandits on the run who would, rob you. So Lu was influenced by his contemporaries to show their examples and also support their large entourage of scholars to compile books and edit the Lu Shi Qinshu. So it should be noted that Lu was enfeoffed in Qin as Lord Wenxin. Wenxin means something like being highly cultured or literate and trustworthy, that he's the trustworthy, cultured person. And so Lu was already recognized as a scholar. And as I propose, if the 12 Chronicles are a kind of lesson plan, when Lu was appointed as the prime minister in 249, he had to start teaching the prince, and he needed some literature. And, you can get some help from your entourage, but you got to edit it, you got to present it as the tutor. So he was already recognized to some extent, at least in Qin, as a scholar.
Ok, James. Như vậy là James vừa mới tóm tắt, tức là kể một câu chuyện cũng hơi dài dòng một chút về lịch sử. Nếu như mà các bạn đọc lịch sử mà tìm hiểu về cái giai đoạn thời Chiến Quốc ngay trước khi nhà Tần thống nhất, về câu chuyện Lã Bất Vi đã dùng mọi biện pháp với tốn rất nhiều tiền, nhiều công sức để có thể đưa một người lên về kế vị nhà Tần, và sau đó thì trở thành có thể coi là trở thành người đỡ đầu cho Tần Thủy Hoàng và trở thành tể tướng ở dưới thời Tần Thủy Hoàng. Thì nếu như mà các bạn tìm hiểu lịch sử, đọc kỹ về cái thời Chiến Quốc và đặc biệt giai đoạn này thì có thể nắm được cái ý mà giáo sư Salmon vừa mới chia sẻ. Đấy là cái quan điểm cho rằng Lã Bất Vi chỉ là một thương nhân thì nó chưa hoàn toàn đầy đủ, chưa hoàn toàn chính xác, đặc biệt là thông qua các cái thông tin trong cái bộ sử ký Tư Mã Thiên mà được bắt đầu bằng bố của Tư Mã Thiên là Tư Mã Đàm đã viết. Thì trong đó có những cái thông tin viết về Lã Bất Vi, và rất nhiều các văn bản chứng minh được ông là một người không chỉ thuần túy là thương nhân. Tất nhiên bây giờ chúng ta khó mà tìm được cái xuất thân chính xác của ông. Vâng, xin đến câu hỏi thứ 6 dành cho James. Câu hỏi cuối cùng của Book Hunter. Đấy là sau đó thì xin mời các bạn khán giả hôm nay đặt câu hỏi cho James. Câu hỏi số 6. Một người hiện đại thì nên tiếp cận Lã Thị Xuân Thu theo cách nào? So have you got the question, James?
Sorry, I was coughing and turned off my microphone.
Okay.
So there's a number of ways you can approach the Lucia Chincho. It contains interesting stories and legends and humorous passages. So it could be read as literature for fun and enjoyment. There's a very funny story where two muy macho strongmen meet, and they both have a reputation as being big tough guys. And so they said, let's have a drink. And they start getting drunk. And the bartender, they say, we're hungry. The bartender says, we don't have any food. So they say, well, let's just cut each other and have a bite to eat. So they start peeling meat off of each other and barbecuing it and having a bite to eat. And then the comment says, if this be courage, I'd rather not be courageous. Lots of cute little stories like this to show people's contradiction. So it can be read as literature. The text can be read as insights into human relationships. That my co-editor of the Tao Companion, Marston Jacoby, has an interesting essay in there that uses the Lucia Chincho to talk about leadership and how the ancient Lucia Chincho has contemporary ideas of leadership in it. And that can be applied to business management and government management, and also to nonprofit organizations, and even at home, because somebody at home has to be the leader. And so you know how to treat people properly. Since the book was compiled by the attendants to Lu Bu Wei, they got a lot to say about how they should be treated, right? The Lucia Chincho can be approached as historical literature that tells us about the aspirations of ancient peoples. It can be studied as a key and culminating the Qin dynasty, the pre-Qin dynasty, warring states, political philosophy, the ultimate synthesis of all of the pre-Qin philosophy. But it does have Lu Bu Wei's unique philosophy. Yellow kind of philosophy? Does it focus more on Tao than Tian, heaven, or more on heaven than Tao? These things still have to be worked. What kind of political cosmology does it have? It also has a kind of interesting ancient anthropology. It describes people from different states doing different things, and how if a person from one state is raised in another state, their behavior will change, their language and accent will change, right? And they'll become a person of that state where they were adopted into. So that's a kind of anthropology, right? So the book can be studied in lots of interesting different ways. But I encourage some questions. Does anyone have any questions to ask?
Thank you, James. Xin mời các bạn gửi câu hỏi cho James ạ. Trong lúc chờ. Okay, we have one hand here. Xin mời bạn Eliza Vũ.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. First, thank you for your sharing. And my question is, how was his philosophy, Lu Bu Wei's philosophy, was received by the two kings that he served, and especially how it was received by Qin Shi Huang, because I know that they had very complicated relationship. So that was my main questions. Anyway, I really appreciated your insights about Lu Bu Wei's identity more than being a merchant. Thank you.
Yeah, that's Yuri Pine's idea is a very interesting idea. So this is a very good question, a very deep question, a very complex question. What was the question again? My short-term memory. Yes, Lu Buwei.
How it was his philosophy.
How his philosophy was received.
Yeah.
That's what very good. How was his philosophy received? So on the one hand, because he was in charge of the army, and he had this idea of the righteous war, that you should not be cutting off people's heads. Shanyang, right, the minister 100 years before, said you should be rewarded, the soldiers should be rewarded by the number of heads they brought back from the military, from the war. Of course, there's a problem with that because you could easily take some heads of unarmed civilians, right, to get more money as a soldier if you brought back more heads. And so Lu Buwei was opposed to this idea. And the evidence is a little bit shaky, but Professor Yang in China argues that they actually stopped the practice of taking heads in the second and third battles that were led by Lu Buwei. Now, the only evidence for this is that the Han Dynasty book of history, the Shiji, does not record the number of heads taken. And so I propose in my chapter that they maybe just didn't record the number of heads to placate Lu Buwei's moral sensibility that you should have a just war. But there's a whole chapter in the Lushi Chunshou on the just war. But the Lushi Chunshou is also arguing that you must go to war to unify the empire. And so he led 3 battles, and then afterwards, the young King Zheng, from the death of Lu Buwei in 236 BC to 221 BC, destroyed the other 6 kingdoms and unified the empire. So that idea from the Lushi Chunshou was a good idea. And the succession that I mentioned, using the 5 phases, that the Qin dynasty should be following the symbol of water because the Zhou was fire and water extinguishes fire, was used by Qin Shi Huangdi. So he was influenced in that regard. But the Lushi Chunshou is critical of Shanyang having a strict legalist, punish the people for everything they do wrong. He's against that idea. He says you should love and benefit the people. And the first emperor didn't seem to accept that. Just as the state of Qin under Shanyang couldn't really fully accept, Shi Zhao's idea to rule with moral virtue and love the people. And so there's a lot of oppression, right? You want people to build the Great Wall, which was started under Qin Shi Huangdi, right? He started a canal system. He started a road system. Very big construction projects require hard labor and taxing the people. And so we could say Qin Shi Huangdi didn't follow the advice of Lu Buwei to treat the people with loving respect. But he did follow the advice to unify the empire. So it's a mixed story. Oh, by the way, people should look at the movies. You can find the movies on Netflix and other places. There are a lot of Chinese movies on Qin Shi Huangdi and Lu Buwei. You can get some quick insight. I should mention my name here. Arawan is my wife's name. She uses my computer to do her online shopping. And now my Google account has been vanquished and co-opted by Arawan.
No problem, James. Vâng, xin mời các bạn khác tiếp tục đặt câu hỏi ạ.
Well, the one thing I kind of skipped over was the etymology. Lu Buwei convinced King Zheng that the aristocrats, that the wealthy businessmen should be able to buy aristocratic titles. And so he created this kind of threefold branch of government that the aristocracy, the people with traditional titles can rule, but also the wealthy could buy titles. And then you can see this as kind of a modern influence, like where American government has been bought out by billionaires. They're making lots of money, but they're not running the country very well. Or running international relations, I must say.
Yeah.
How crazy.
Tôi bất ngờ với lại cái thông tin về thương ngưỡng tể tướng của nhà Tần, rất là một người rất là nổi tiếng, mà lại nhưng mà đúng là cũng là rất là khắc nghiệt khi mà các cái chính sách của ông nó có phần hơi tàn bạo, gọi là gì, trao thưởng dựa trên số thụ cấp mang về, thật là kinh khủng. Vâng, xin mời bạn Khánh Vi ạ.
I just have a question that, firstly, thanks for your series is so meaningful to me, and I have a question that how has this ideology influenced the way China builds its image and identity internationally? Yeah, I just have one.
Yeah, it kind of runs deep as the dragon people, you know. If you look at the dragon, let's talk about the dragon for a second. China is the dragon people. You know, the dragon as a symbol is an eclectic symbol. It has many animal parts to it. So a lot of, you know, ancient culture was based on a lot of totemism. Your state was based on a tribalism, the tribe saw themselves as descendants from a certain animal. So in the dragon, you see the lion, you see the snake, you see elements of the tiger. There are different animals. It's got claws, right? It's got a bird's beak. It's got different elements combined together. And that's kind of the foundation of Chinese culture, is that it is an amalgamated, sewn together, weaved together kind of cultural experience. And still today, one of the things makes Chinese culture so exciting is the food. The variety of food, right? The northern cuisine is very different from the southern cuisine, is very different from Sichuan's food, is very spicy, right? Is very different kind of flavors, right? And that's an important part still of China's attraction today, right? McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken have got nothing to hold against your local Chinese restaurant. So the Lu Shichinchou, in proposing that you can unify the empire and have a unified empire that's made up of different cultures, like the dragon, made up of different peoples, but still working together, like Lu Buwei's entourage of the people that he brought to the court to write the Lu Buwei and to help him manage the government. They came from different places, right? They didn't come from the state of Qin. They were, foreigners imported, which now a lot of countries have picked up on this crazy idea. You don't want foreigners. Actually, you do. You want as many foreigners as you can get, because they'll have interesting ideas and they'll stimulate your economy, for God's sake. Okay. So the Chinese are still practicing this. A lot of professors now that, America's higher ed is being attacked by our crazy federal administration. They've gone to Canada and they've gone to China. A number of my friends are professors in China. And so there's that unified image out of diversity. That's part of the core of the Chinese culture that makes China so attractive globally. And then as they've expanded their economy, they've purchased, they've given a lot of loans in Africa. And then the country can't pay back the loan, and then China ends up owning the land. we've got a big controversy here in Guam about deep sea mining and scraping the ocean floor. China's been scraping the ocean floor for a very long time already. It's not really economically viable. You can't make a profit with it yet. But if you get those rare earth minerals that are on the ocean floor now, which China has been doing, they will be worth a lot more in the future to build those batteries, right, that will run the battery buses and cars. So I think the Lusher Chuncho is indirectly tied to China expanding today because it laid the foundation for the imperial system that's still underlying the Chinese Communist Party way of organizing the government as a central kingdom. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Xin mời tiếp các bạn khác đặt câu hỏi ạ. While waiting for others to raise a question, may I ask one question?
Sure.
I'm curious about, can you give us a short history of how the Western scholar started to research to try to understand the Chinese classics?
Oh, to study the Chinese classics in general.
Yes.
Sure. Oh my, it goes back to the 1500s. Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit from Rome, went to China and brought back texts. And he had to learn Chinese because he was living in China. And he started to study Confucianism, and he brought texts back to Rome, had texts shipped back to Rome. And some of it, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, the famous I Ching, the classic of changes, influenced Leibniz and the development of calculus. And so it goes back to the 1500s and the 1600s when Hegel wrote his World History of Philosophy. He wasn't very kind to China, but he had studied the Book of Changes, and he had studied some of the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way and Its Power from Taoism. That there was a copy and a translation in the library in Austria, but the real push really started in the mid to late 1800s. The missionary James Legge from England, a Protestant missionary, translated the 5 classics and the 4 books of Confucianism in the 1880s, and those are still in use today and still cited today. In the late 1800s, 1898 or so, there was a world religion forum where major religious leaders from all around the world went to this forum. And then that helped start to introduce Confucianism and Taoism to the Western world. Then in the 20th century, there's some controversy in the early 20th century. I was just reading some of the biography of Dirk Bode, the translator of Feng Youlan's History of Chinese Philosophy. And he was told in the 1930s that there was no luck for him to, teach Chinese history or Chinese literature in an American university, that he should become a journalist, that he should just become an author. But then after he translated Feng Youlan's History of Chinese Philosophy, which Feng Youlan was trained in philosophy at the University of Chicago. So that's interesting. There was a lot of Chinese scholars who studied in America, and then brought back Western ideas back to China, but also left some Chinese ideas in America. And then figures like Dirk Bode, after he translated that 2-volume History of Chinese Philosophy, it started in 1937, the first volume was translated. Then it was accessible for other people to start to see it in English and want to learn Chinese. And so Dirk Bode really got the Chinese program started at Penn State, and then that became an example for other American universities to start a Chinese program. Then, in the 70s, after Nixon went to China and supposedly, open trade with China and whatnot, then there was a lot more interest in people learning Chinese to do business with China, more interest in wanting to know about Chinese culture and Chinese history and what influences Chinese people. And so then after the 70s, it really took off as a growth industry in academia until just recently. Like I say, the federal Department of Education is now attacking higher education, and a number of professors have moved to Canada or Europe or China itself to teach and do their research. But that in a nutshell.
Thank you, James. Xin mời bạn Elisa Vũ.
Hi, I have some follow-up questions.
Good.
First question, I have not read his philosophy fully, so I'm not sure whether there was any mention of women or women rights, whether he expressed any concerns for women in ancient China. And my second question was more about his career as a statesman. He used money to buy his way into the highest echelons of power in China. After that, was he corrupt? Thank you.
Okay, women in Chinese history is a big gap there. We're not even sure who Confucius's mother was. So there's very little. One peculiar story about suicide by a hairpin, as I recall. That the woman was very frustrated with the way she was being treated in the family, and then used her hairpin as her weapon. There's another peculiar story where the woman was advised that just in case there was a divorce, she should try to hide some money outside of the family, right? So she'd have some financial security if there was a divorce. And then when the mother-in-law and the family found out that the wife was saving money outside of the household, they wanted a divorce. Oh, this kind of peculiar story. But this is part of the problem with ancient Chinese philosophy. There is in Confucianism, the problem is that women are hardly ever mentioned. In doing my research on the Han Dynasty recently, most of the emperors of the Han Dynasty, we don't know who their mother's name was even. So there is no discussion of human rights per se or political rights. They wanted to do things rightly or correctly, but women are almost hardly ever mentioned in pre-Qin literature at all. Lu Buwei, how corrupt was he? That's the funny thing. If you watch those movies that come out of China, they make him out to be a real corrupt bad guy, following the tradition of slandering him in the ancient book of history. But so since when he bought his way into the court of Qin, and he was made the prime minister of Qin under King Shang, then he, was a powerful person, and he was the general basically also, and had to run 3 campaigns for the state of Qin, and then produced his book. And so everything was looking very good. But then there's this peculiar story of the Lao Ai rebellion that supposedly the Empress Dowager was very licentious and had a big sexual appetite, and he introduced her to a guy who was a fake eunuch. He wasn't a eunuch, and he still had his genitals, and supposedly, he was well endowed, as the story goes. When it come out, he had his nipples. He had his nipples. He was very well endowed. And the Empress Dowager loved him, and they had 2 children. And supposedly they were starting to, they got a copy of the chop of the emperor, and they were going to start a rebellion against the emperor and put themselves on the throne. And Lu Buwei was implicated in this rebellion. And it's hard to say how much of it is true and not true. We just don't have a good record of it. Usually we rely on what the history book said, but the history book was clearly tampered with. And so it's hard to say whether or not he really introduced Lao Ai to the Empress Dowager and whether or not he was really this corrupt guy. And it goes against some of the passages in the Lu Shi Chunshou that talk about being a truthful and honest and respectful person. And when he was enfeoffed and given the land, his Wen Xin, he's got honesty built into his adopted name. So how bad was he really? It's hard to say because he was slandered so badly. What was the third part of the question?
There are only two parts. Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Bạn Elisa có cần hỏi thêm gì không ạ?
No, thank you. Em hỏi xong rồi.
Okay, thank you, James. There is one question in the message from Bùi Hoàng Anh. So she asked a question to James. What do Western scholars think about patriarchal authorities in the political philosophy of Chinese governance? Why do old traditions from Lu Qi Jinchu Confucianism to legalisms, they all emphasize the roles of the eldest sons? And how has this influenced China and the region around?
Yeah. It's, the traditional approach was, and throughout the 2,000-year imperial tradition, was the first son got everything, and the second son, got far less, especially in the imperial aristocratic family. So that firstborn son, dominated everything. It was a patriarchal system. The men ruled it. There were some, women dowagers. There were some dowager empresses that took over and had a healthy rule, like the Empress Dowager at the end of the Qing dynasty, for example. There was a powerful Empress Dowager in the Tang dynasty. But for the most part, you're right. It was a patriarchal system. It was built by men, run for men. And the eldest son of the aristocrat got the main inheritance, and the daughter was married off. And historically speaking, in the Tang dynasty, the Tang emperor was fascinated by a dancing girl who had very tiny feet, and then this crazy tradition of foot bounding developed out of that. That emperor's, foot fetish, the foot fetish for tiny feet. And then women started thinking, oh, we should all have small feet. And that led to foot binding. And I don't know if you know anything about this horrific practice, but for more than 1,000 years, from the end of the Tang dynasty to the end of even after the Qing dynasty, some aristocrats were still binding their daughter's feet. What you do is you wrap the toes underneath the arch. So you basically break their foot in half. And some people died from it because they got, blood poisoning in the process of foot binding. You do it slowly, day by day. You wrap the toes in a cloth and pull it back underneath the foot. And then, of course, you can't hardly walk, and you certainly can't run away. I compare it to wearing high heels. Although some women have told me that high heels they find very comfortable and they can run in their high heels. So if you can run away in your high heels for self-protection and, divorce,
Thank you, James.
Yeah, yes, this is the big shortcoming of ancient Chinese philosophy. And then in modernizing it, what I have proposed is that when they talk about men, we should translate it as humanity. When they talk about humanity, they meant men, but we should now understand it in the modern sense of all human beings. And that we have to, the Chinese have the saying, women hold up half the sky. Actually, we know it's more like 85%. You know what I mean? 85%, not 80%.
Ok, xin mời các bạn khác tiếp tục đặt câu hỏi cho James. Chắc là một câu nữa trước khi chúng ta kết thúc chương trình ngày hôm nay. So one last question, James.
Sure.
Okay. You are not tired yet?
No. You got me excited. You got my adrenaline flowing.
Yeah. I think we are now in the modern world, modern society, but there are still a lot of stuff, routine and tradition that are still seem quite crazy, huh?
Yeah. And maybe that's partly why the world is crazy today, is we're still inheriting these out-of-date ideas. So many people still all around the world give more to their firstborn son.
Yeah, and especially now, also in Vietnam, many families still trying to have a son, after like 3 or 4 daughters.
Yes. And it's, you can say, well, Vietnam was influenced by Chinese culture, but it's true everywhere. The Arabs want firstborn sons too, right? This kind of gender bias.
Không biết còn bạn nào có câu hỏi nữa không ạ? Ok, nếu như mà không còn câu hỏi nào thì tôi xin phép được kết thúc chương trình ngày hôm nay tại đây. Thank you, James. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope I wish you have a good health and have a nice day. And we can maybe we can meet another times for the next books.
Yes. Yeah, we have to talk about the Tao Companion to the Lucia Chincho.
Yeah. Can you show your book behind?
It will be exciting.
The red one, yeah. The Timing and Lucy. Các bạn nhìn thấy đây là bản dịch tiếng Việt của cuốn sách của James. Cuốn sách Timing and Rulership in Spring and Autumn Honors. And the original one was the behind James, the red one. Vâng. Hy vọng các bạn có thể tìm đọc để tham khảo thêm. Rất cảm ơn các bạn đã dành thời gian với Book Hunter và James hôm nay. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn trong các sự kiện lần sau. Tạm biệt các bạn. Thank you, James.
Yeah, there's no way to move the camera around. The camera's backwards. I tell you, my one auntie is Chinese. She drew the 4 seasons. She drew these
4
seasons for the book cover. That's always very famous. Always got the 4 seasons. Any Chinese restaurant you go to, has paintings, pictures of the four seasons. And that's the foundation of the 12 Chronicles in the Lucia Show.
Uh-huh.
And
You know
yeah.
what? You know what? We use what I use the book, the Spring and Autumns, mainly for food. You know, we so we follow the rule, the instruction for Master Lu about what to eat in the right season, the right time.
Yeah, that's something that's come, that maybe is the legacy of, you should eat certain food in a certain season so you feel cool in the summer and warm in the winter. The funny thing is, by southern Vietnam, do you have 4 seasons or only 2?
Oh, that's the north where I live. We have 4 seasons, but the south, I think there are only 2 seasons. Yeah. They don't have.
Yeah, in Guam we only have 2 seasons. It's dry 6 months of the year and wet 6 months of the year. So we have dry season and rainy season. Yeah.
Okay, James. See you next time.
Nice talking with you. Talk to you next time.
Yeah.
And thank you for your questions. Have a good day.
Yeah, have a nice day.
Prosperity and good health to you too.